Hola, scholars. Welcome. We are looking at readings today from Queer Theory Now, Chapter 5, pages 118 to 152. So that chapter is called Outing the Closet. And then we're also looking at some selections from Queer, a Graphic History, and we're going to look at pages 89 through 97. And they overlap really nicely, and they also really follow with last week's lecture as well. Last week we focused mainly on this book and Judith Butler and Michel Foucault. And we're going to get more of Butler this week. So I'm just going to start us through the beginning of this chapter, chapter 5, and then I will do some brief overlaps from our queer graphic history book. So with the start of Outing the Closet, chapter 5, it brings us back to a point that we read in this book about De Laurentiis and her use of the word queer at the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1990 when she used it at a conference, Queer Theory. And so there's a nice overlap there. And I want to point out one really, really important point from De Laurentiis, and that is in the middle of page 118, that they sought to challenge these stable identity categories as a strategy of resistance, one that afforded individuals the possibility not to adhere to any one of the given terms, not to assume their ideological liabilities, but instead to transgress and transcend them, or at the very least, problematize them. And these categories that they're talking about is the terms prior to the use of the word queer being coined. So ideas like lesbian, gay, even homosexual, she's taking it further than that. And so I really, really like this definition. And it relates very heavily to what the two main theorists that we're looking at in this chapter, Judith Butler and Sedgwick, are both exploring in terms of a post-structuralist approach to sex, gender, and sexuality. And what do I mean when I say post-structuralist? The definition of that is also on page 118 at the bottom. To deconstruct the relationships between these categories and problematize normative models of identity. So it's this notion that fixed realities and fixed terms and the idea that you're born one way or the other, all of that is constructed out of knowledge and meaning, and it's not as definitive as we think. And a lot of that ties into gender performativity, and especially with Judith Butler and gender trouble. And that's talked a little bit on page 119. And there is really good discussions of drag queens as well in this chapter. And for gender performativity, the definition of that is at the top of page 119. This is the idea that gender involves the repetition of acts in a predetermined social context over time, which makes gender appear natural and innate. So if we think of repetition of acts and a predetermined social context over time, so the idea that women wear dresses, and this is gender performativity that has occurred throughout the decades and has become associated with femininity, or the idea that women wear heels or makeup or have long hair. These can all be described as forms of gender performativity. Okay, so as we go on with this chapter, we get into discussions about Judith Butler and their work first. So Judith Butler's work reveals, quote, a lifelong dedication to interrogating the ways in which identity norms are taken up and subject positions assumed. That is at the bottom of page 119. As you continue in this chapter, you will see notable works by Butler on page 120, and I highlighted a really good quote again on page 120, right in the center. Butler argued that feminism's focus on the woman question was deeply flawed because the subject of his analysis, woman, was an exclusionary construct that was stabilized only via a gender binary, underpinned by heterosexuality. So even our term women and woman and the woman issue is problematic because it implies this stability that doesn't really exist, that is upheld by binaries. And remember, binaries are not good. We don't want to have this privileging of one, norming of one, and undermining of the other side of the binary. So as you continue reading, key questions for Judith Butler's work are expressed at the bottom of page 121 in the section titled Butler's Approach to Sex and Gender. And some of those questions include, what is the relationship between sex, gender, and sexuality? Does sex determine gender? And does gender determine sexuality? So those are three really good key questions of Butler's theorizing philosophies. And I would actually write down those three questions as you're reading this chapter, and then see if you can answer them after you're done with the sections on Judith Butler. I'm not going to give you the answer because you should figure that out as you're reading in this chapter. I think that the gender binary chart with the heterosexual matrix that William Leonard adopted from Butler's work and theorizing is really a great way of understanding the normalization process that occurs. And I think you can see it right here. It's at the top of page 122. And so even from the first utterances of a child's birth, in which, and people don't do this so often, they do big gender reveal parties first, prior to the child even being born. So, I mean, it occurs even before the child is out of the womb, but the proclamation of it's a boy, it's a girl, and it takes the individual body down a trajected path that leads to a heteronormative assumption or lifestyle, right? Regardless of whether that is true or not. So I think that, and I had mentioned this before in class and maybe in an earlier lecture, this idea of even sex it doesn't have to be a binary. Because of the possibilities of how bodies are formed and intersex individuals, and it's more complicated than that. It's talked a little bit about at the top of page 123. So I think a good summary point about that is at the bottom of page 123, before you get to the question, what is gender anyway? It says, throughout Gender Trouble, Butler outlines a queer proposition, that it is not enough to rethink our assumptions about what gender is and how it works, we must also do the same for sex. However, if we were to think of sex as a constructed category that was always already inflected by gender, then our existing definitions of gender also need revising. And so then that's why we transition into, well, what is gender anyways? And the key answer to that question, I'm going to give it to you. It's at the bottom of page 124. According to Butler, gender is a doing, not a being. So we perform our gender. And that's at the very bottom of 124. There's some discussions about gender melancholy that is related to some ideas worked from Freud. I'm going to gloss over that little section to get to gender performativity. And this is a really good section. It starts at the bottom of page 126. This is a really good section to help you understand more about drag queens, about doing drag, about the subversion act of drag. And that also gets discussed more in depth on page 129. But before we get there, I do want to point out on, I guess, the bottom of 126, that gender performativity is not an attribute or an essence, but an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. Butler refers to the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and enactments of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self. And they do a really good job, the author, of delineating between performance and performative. So Butler does not view the expression of gender as a performance. And when you think of performance, maybe acting and in Hollywood, performative is different. So really pay attention to the idea of performative that is discussed on page 127. On subversion and drag, that, as I mentioned, is discussed on page 129. So Butler suggests that certain enactments of gender, such as drag performances and butch femme relationships, can be subversive because they question the foundations of gender norms. Such enactments can suddenly and significantly upset the assumptions that we make about sex bodies. For Butler, the norms of gender can be split, exaggerated, parodied. Such subversive actions highlight the strange, the incoherent, that which falls outside. So that's on page 129. And part of that significance is about reclaiming power as well, in terms of who can use their bodies to express a certain act or a certain way of being, right? So I'm going to jump us ahead to Sedgwick, Eve Sedgwick, just because there's a lot of discussions here and the lecture is going to get super long otherwise. So make sure you read some of these other sections on Butler. Sedgwick starts on page 136, and I think that they really exemplify the act of being very interdisciplinary in their terms of their writings and their research prior to queer theory getting really established. Their notable selection of work is at the top of page 138, and you can see that it has a gamut of art, of literature, of artistic performance. So there's a lot to look at in terms of Sedgwick's covering of different topics. I think Sedgwick's axioms they start on page 138. The table is available on 139. I think it's really important to understand what these axioms mean. And I think the table helps you because it shows you the theory on the left and the practical example on the right. And then there's a really big discussion about Sedgwick's notions about the closet and about binaries as kind of master narratives, so to speak. That's talked about at the top of page 144. And then there's a whole quote from Sedgwick's writings about binaries, and it, goes through secrecy, disclosure, knowledge, ignorance, private, public, masculine, feminine, and it's the whole categorization of examples. As you keep reading, there is a really neat kind of interrupting box here at the bottom of 146 called Queer Theory in Practice, Queer Methods. And I think that's really great, especially for anyone that is considering academic related work. Methodologies are the way we utilize academic theories within our research, within our writing, within even our teaching pedagogy and our teaching practices. So they give you some really good examples of queer methodologies there. So as someone in academia, I really appreciated it. There are some discussions of Diana Fuss at the top of page 149, which will actually connect very nicely with our other textbook. And that's where I'm going to take us to. But before I get to that section, I just wanted to also, in the summary of this chapter, give you the overview that the author has about both authors, about both theorists, that both scholars took queer as a means of destabilizing, unsettling, revealing, subverting, opening, and questioning established norms around categories of sex, gender, sexuality, and identity. So I really think on page 150, that is a wonderful way to end the chapter. And then I'm going to just, rather than make a separate video, just give you the connecting points because they connect really well with the Queer Theory Now book. So you should have been reading pages 89 through 97. So at 89, they talk a little bit about normativities. And then how do we interrogate normativity, especially heteronormativity. And so the author of this book stresses that in order to undermine a master narrative, you have to actually talk about it. So in an LGBTQ plus class, we don't only talk about LGBTQ plus, but we would be talking about heteronormativity as well. And then this is where we get into the overlap between the two textbooks. So on page 91 in this textbook, you'll see Diana Fuss is mentioned, and that relates to page 148 to 149 in this textbook. And we have the Inside Out reference, the collection of queer theory, and the binaries talked about and really exemplified in the graphic textbook very well, with male, female, strong, weak. They're juxtaposed next to each other. And Fuss's particular argument discussing why we need to reveal the ways in which this hierarchical binary structure operates in order to understand other hierarchies of power and knowledge. So we have discussed this coming out notion in class or maybe in another lecture. So there's this fear that coming out as gay risks reinforcing a hierarchical binary structure that underlines heteronormativity and homophobia. And it can also marginalize anybody who still remains in the closet, so to speak. So Fuss's work is about undermining some of those problematizing aspects with, quote, coming out. And then, of course, Sedgwick is discussed in our graphic history book. And so on page 93 in that textbook, they bring up particularly the essay, How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay from 1991. And that connects with page 140 in Queer Theory Now. So you can kind of read them in conjunction with each other. And again, the epistemology of the closet. So remember, epistemology is a fancy word, but it just means the study of knowledge. This epistemology of the closet is discussed in a lot of depth in this book, from 142 to 150. And then even the nature-nurture aspect on page 95, it's addressed in Axiom 4 of Sedgwick's axiom discussion in our Queer Theory Now book, and that is page 139. So this notion of someone being born gay versus becoming gay or whatnot, and they give a very glossy explanation in the graphic history book on page 95. And then the end of your section of this reading is again about assumed norms and how do we move beyond sexuality and gender. So, as always, if you have any questions about either one of these texts or the chapters that you read, reach out to me via Canvas email.